Hello, welcome everybody. We're going to give everyone a few seconds to get settled, and then we'll very soon get underway. Thank you for joining us. Few more seconds. I think we can start. Again, hello everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone that has joined us today. We have over 300 registrations. People from 42 countries around the world are joining us for this in-session talk. I want to keep the books. Before I introduce you to our esteemed guests, please allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. You've probably noticed today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link to the recording after the event at some point next week on the RCA website. We invite you to ask questions using the Q&A function. You can also upvote any questions that you might find interesting and would like our guests to answer. We'll try to answer as many as time allows, of course. And please use the chat button if you have any technical difficulties regarding the webinar. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kathrin Böhm, Gerrie van Noord, and Rosie Ram. I'm going to hand you over to Rosie, who is going to start today's conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jo. Hello, everyone. And as Jo said, a very warm welcome to this in-session event, I Want to Keep the Books, which is being brought to you today by the Curating Contemporary Art programme in the School of Arts and Humanities here at the RCA. My name is Rosie Ram, and I'm a tutor in Curating Contemporary Art, and I'm delighted to be joined by my fellow tutor on the CCA programme, Gerrie van Noord, and the artist Kathrin Böhm. Today's discussion has been programmed in conjunction with a new short course that Gerrie and I are convening, which explores the expanded and often highly collaborative practices of publishing, editing, and writing. And as an entry point into these discussions, we were incredibly excited to invite Kathrin to join Gerrie today to reflect upon the ways in which different modes of publishing can serve both as forms of archive and documentation, as well as offering new sites of activation and contemporary practice. On the CCA programme, we've noticed an ever-increasing appetite for and enthusiasm among students for exploring publishing in its expanded forms, both online and in print. And we felt like this seemed like an excellent moment to reflect upon the possibilities for this kind of practice within the space of curating and contemporary art. We'll ensure that we have plenty of time for Q&A discussion and questions. So please do, as Jo said, use the Q&A function on Zoom and post your questions for Kathrin and Gerrie, and we'll make sure that we come to those at the end of today's talk. So before I hand over, I just wanted to introduce very briefly Kathrin and Gerrie to you all. Kathrin Böhm works across interdependent realms of cultural production, including the art world. Her research, writing, organising and constructing supports collective forms of reproducing public space, taking back the economy for people and the planet, and enabling a new translocalism that acknowledges the rural. Kathrin teaches and publishes regularly, and as a researcher contributes to the wider topics of the new economy, the usership of art, and the production of public space. And in 2020, Kathrin stopped initiating new projects and engaged in a process of composting, using what she had already produced as an artist so far in order to make fertilizer for involving long-term infrastructures. Gerrie is an editor and educator. She's interested in publishing as an environment for the articulation of and critical reflection on creative practices. Gerrie has worked on a wide range of publishing projects, including Afterlives for Art Angel and Fabrications for Bookworks. She's produced several critical anthologies and works for the open access peer-reviewed journal Pass. Recent projects with artists include a selection of Isabel Nolan's writing, a website on Olivia Plender's work, and a wonderful new book, which I have here, on Kathrin Böhm's practice, which I know they'll both be discussing with everyone today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Gerrie and to Kathrin.
Thanks very much, Jo, and also Rosie. Before I hand over to Kathrin, I want to sort of briefly elaborate on some of the things that Rosie has indicated. I'm firmly situated in the field of curating, but I don't function as a traditional curator. because I mainly work on publications in relation to artistic and curatorial practice. In recent years, I've therefore started to call myself a curator of publications. And I'm particularly interested in publications in their various forms and formats and functions, where indeed we could think about them as dissemination vehicles of information about art and curatorial projects. But also I'm very much interested in them as sites of articulation in which practices take shape or form in some shape or form. And that is very much the reason why I wanted to invite Kathrin to have a conversation about how that happens in her practice in all its diversity. The title of today's session, I Want to Keep the Books, is derived from a taped text in the exhibition Compost that took place in the summer of 2021 here in London at the showroom. And as Rosie already indicated, rather than exhibiting new work, that was very much an environment in which Kathrin really reflected on what she had produced so far and brought all the residues, all the material related to past work into the exhibition space, turning the heap of material and trying to sort of figure out what to take forward into future practice. And although I had known about Kathrin's work for a long time, it was through visiting Compost, the show, and through co-editing the book Art on the Scale of Life, that I got to know the breadth and scope of the practice in greater detail. And what the 2 years of working on the book really revealed to me was that although Kathrin's practice doesn't operate in traditional ways, publishing is very much part and parcel of how it circulates and how it makes itself manifest, and what is articulated in that as a broader spectrum of making things manifest. And while we no doubt will talk about Art on the Scale of Life and other books, I'm going to hand over to Kathrin and because I've asked her to introduce that broader spectrum of using and mobilizing publishing in her practice. So over to you, Kathrin.
Yeah, just first of all, I want to say thank you to the whole team for making this lunch talk possible. That's Joe, Hazel, Rosie, and Gerrie. Thank you very much. Gerrie asked me to quickly put some slides together, so I don't have to talk too much, but also guide with images through forms of publishing and reasons for publishing across various collaborations and projects. So I'm going to be doing this for the next 10 minutes, and this is not just a lunch talk. That's not for the next a lunch run through quite a bit of work. So I'm going through about 20 slides just to give some ideas of what publishing means to me, also in relation to creating public realms, publishing ideas, located ideas in different places, and which forms they take. So I'm opening with a slide, me wearing a jacket that says CNP, and before there's any misunderstandings, it means cut and paste. And it stands for something quite important in my work. My work as an artist, I would describe as mainly concerned with public realm, the making of public space, but not so much the making, but the kind of like nurturing and supporting public realms in which a lot of the practices, ideas that exist in a place can become visible. And the speed or the pace with which it's done is often ad hoc. That's where the cut and paste is referring to that. And I'm showing the first example, which is from a project quite a few years ago, 21 in Hackney in East London, where together with the artist Nicoline van Harskamp, we cut and pasted ideas for public space into the public space. That might look very casual, but the publishing aspect here was that It was a larger consultation project for a huge housing estate, asking residents what they would like to see in their immediate public realm. And instead of noting those ideas, we published them as real life scenarios. So whether it was a kitchen, a camping site, a sculpture, and so on. So this ad hocness, publishing things on a one-to-one scale within a situation, is meant to be illustrated here. I've been using posters and print, different forms of printing across many, many works. If I do them by myself, they're under the name of And Millions and Millions. This idea that we, of course, live in a kind of infinite number of possible images that we can arrange in an infinite number of constellations, but also as a way of publishing what we want to say in public space. That was with young women from a neighborhood in Copenhagen, in Tinberg, and together we designed, printed, and then pasted those posters as a form of publishing ideas like messages, slogans from this group, but also in order to reclaim public space. It was a corridor that was underused, quite threatening, to reclaim this public space through publishing and pasting those posters. Publishing for me is also always concerned with distribution. Those posters across the many, many, many different iterations are normally given away after what was posted is left over. And it's like thinking of publishing as distribution, as a free resource, as something that's open to interpretation. Why someone would want to take a poster and where they would bring it is very open-ended. I co-founded an art and architecture collective called Public Works in the early 2000s. And within that practice, again, this idea of publishing as part of working on site, collecting ideas for changing a place, publishing became a form of, on the scale of the project, communicating with about who has been involved with which ideas, and on the scale, in this case, of a milk float. Another example is, of course, exhibitions as formats of publishing, or publishing ideas, showing, sharing, distributing, reflecting. An exhibition at Stanley Picker Gallery, again, quite a few years ago, where the methods of displaying, discussing, using the public space of the gallery also turned into fanzines. So for a very long time, fanzines in the very ad hoc and quite quick responsive manner have been a very important part of self-publishing, but also testing visual languages, forms of sloganeering, both within an exhibition, but also a fanzine format. Publishing entered many different forms, including teaching at the Architectural Association in London, where the fanzine was, again, in teaching terms, a form to ask students and invite students to pin down their ideas in a communicative manner. So it could have been a portfolio, it could have been a slideshow, but we preferred the format of fanzines as something that can also be published easily and distributed easily. Websites, of course, which might be a little bit too obvious, but websites more in terms of publishing ongoing processes of architectural design, of participatory design processes. This one for Gasworks Gallery, where the publishing tool of the website also was the archive of the instances that informed ideas which led to redesigns. Back to the cut and paste, claiming that printing and production can happen anywhere, everywhere, quite quickly, setting up poster publication stations in any back room with a bit of tape, with a bit of paper, and strong messages. moving on to like more formalized publishing, I'm also the co-founder of a group called My Villages, an artist initiative that specifically addresses the rural as a place for contemporary cultural art and cultural production. So within the bigger collective of my Villages, we have published books over the years, mainly to expand a field of discourse and a field of practice that, let's say, 15, 20 years ago was overlooked, the rural as a place for artists to work in. So books then are, in the kind of more traditional sense, the format in which to conclude, publish, claim ideas into a wider audience through the different publishers and distributors. Books are there to learn, and learning is there to act. So I think that's a kind of constant across the publishing efforts, that capturing a knowledge we hold about a place or the community holds about their place, and how can we use this knowledge in book format, in fanzine format, to act together, also translocally, as it was mentioned earlier. My Villages, we like using websites, of course, obviously, for obvious reasons. But one reason I wanted to emphasize here was, if you look at the lower part of the slide, it says timeline. And the format of websites just gives us much more space and, let's say, independence to describe how we as artists actually enter a place like a village, how we start working there, what are the connections. So the website here is to step away from describing work as projects, but work as relationship building, connecting with other communities of interest and practice across a quite large European geography. We sometimes try to conclude quite vast, complex aspects into single prints. This one is one I particularly still like. It's a word search, because the work of My Villages is so invisible. You know, which rural communities have we worked with over the years? So they're all in this word search. You can find them. Suddenly they become visible. So here the poster is to publish a geography, but also to announce a visibility and invisibility at the same time. I founded a drinks enterprise in Barking, which is still ongoing, which is many different things, but amongst those many different things, we do make drinks. And the bottle as a quite effective way of publishing has established itself over the last 10 years. So the bottles, the labels carry information about who went picking, what did we pick, where does the recipe come from that was used to make the drink. But the bottles and the publishing on the bottles also supports, in the case of Sour Brexit, campaigns around the EU referendum. And more recently, the labels have become a very useful and accessible way of publishing our values, beyond a description of just the drink, but the ethics of the organization. And this kind of publishing, printing, sloganeering is then used across exhibitions. On the right-hand side, I think blackboards are really overlooked publishing devices. If anyone's going to Freeze soon, you will find this billboard there. Tape talks, again, for me, go back to this idea of cutting and pasting. So instead of using PowerPoints, I tape messages, claims for kind of performative talks, often within art environments. And then they're often then again used in other forms of publications. Make it clear, keep it complex, make it clear is another initiative I was actively involved in, where again, a Remain campaign running up to the EU referendum used different formats of if anyone wants to count how often I say publishing, if I reach 100, please give me a shout. Again, different forms of quite ad hoc publishing were used to support the campaign, which, I mean, any campaign does. Any campaign would have various printed, publicized material, including T-shirts / merchandise. I'm coming to the exhibition that Gerrie was referring to, Compost at the Showroom, which was a format for me to rethink and fertilize, create fertilizer from the work to date. But an important part of the show was a big kind of publishing wall, which constantly got adapted with ideas, concepts, proposals that came through conversations in the space. And I think a key moment of publishing there was publishing the budgets, which refers back to this whole idea of taking back the economy, becoming clearer about the economy that we as artists or cultural workers or art workers rely on. So this is less about a publication format, but the fact that we start to publish the diverse economies behind the work that we do. And when I started Compost, I had this slogan on the wall that said, all I want to keep is the books and some boxes, which effectively then distilled into this book, Art on the Scale of Life, which is co-edited by Gerrie and has recently been published by Sternberg. So I think that's my 8 minutes gone, and I stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Kathrin. That was a really good, dense, but also very complex summary in which there is a lot to unpick and unpack. And I think what I want to do is maybe sort of tease out or pull out a couple of things that you've carefully planted in this presentation, but maybe think about that more proactively. I want to sort of maybe start with the notion of invisibility and visibility, and particularly also in relation to sort of how you outlined your practice. A lot is about ways of working that indeed don't operate don't operate necessarily in traditional ways. You don't make objects that go on display. You work in the public realm very often with others. So that notion of invisibility and visibility, but also then thinking about text and image, and text as image in the public realm as something to maybe sort of expand on, because there's something in the mode of address of a lot of the text that seem ad hoc, that seem DIY, but actually do set things in motion very extensively.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe to come back to the idea of invisibility first, which of course is always a critique of what is visible. So I think working within the realm of nurturing, supporting public space that's not defined by a physicality, by a physical architecture, the invisibility is immediately obvious. You know, we do not make pavilions, we do not make buildings, but we still create public spaces that can be recognized and described by those who use them or become part of them. So in that context, the publications and the books around mainly the work of public works were important to also claim non-built architecture as an architectural practice. So the books give space to a kind of more critical discourse and critique of architecture that focuses on the built environment and make space to describe social constructs equally as architecture. So the invisibility there is mainly about insisting that something that seems invisible still exists. I think with the work with my villages, the invisibility comes more from this geography we work in, which is a geography of rural communities, which again, as a critique of who's being portrayed as cultural place or cultural spaces, they're normally situated within urban environments. So there's a kind of instant invisibility of anything that happens in the rural. So for my villages, the books, publications, the more formal books and publications were important to say, no, we want to shift the discourse around where does cultural production actually happen. You know, the rural might be invisible, but it's not non-existent as a cultural space. So there, in both cases, it's more of also kind of political claim and demand that we pay attention to things that might not be visible within the format of the build or the form of the city, but still exist. So I think I lost your third part of the question now.
No,
but just to reiterate, it's a critique. You know, the publication is also a kind of active counterposition to highly visible formats such as the built architecture and the urban.
Well, that maybe sort of like leads me to another kind of question that is directly connected in how you've articulated this. The notion of values. It seems that in a lot of your activities where you visualize things through modes of publishing, it is about sort of drawing attention to particular kind of values, whether that is in an exhibition space or through a publication that circulates and makes a whole set of practices and concerns visible.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you want to...
I fortunately have my value bottle next to me. Maybe I come back to company drinks here, because that's quite a good example for like, I'm very clear about what I'm doing, but it's difficult to describe sometimes. So company drinks can easily be described as a drinks company, but it's first and foremost a place that we hold together to share and nurture the values that we have together. So in that sense, the values that we hold in common and collectively have to be published. They have to be made clear somewhere. So it's never about values that we impose, but values that we share with others, and values with which we want to build something together, whether it's a drinks company or a kind of community or network of practitioners. So the values as published, clear statements then become important, not to misunderstand what things are about. So of course, the values all refer to inclusive, anti-racist, anti-discriminatory practices, which to us in the art world are often quite given. That's what we assume what the values are. But I guess because the work I'm doing is often outside of a certain cultural bubble or a certain art world bubble, those values are just important to distinguish the ambition or the aim from maybe contradicting interests that come along.
Well, I think that notion of assuming and actually literally articulating them, making them visible, then sort of like works both within and out with the art world.
I mean, I really think that bottles are completely undervalued publishing devices, because, you know, it's a bit like cereal boxes. Everybody will read everything. So I can just promote bottles.
There's something in the also the title of Keep It Complex, Make It Clear, that sort of relates to what you're talking about. And I think there's an interesting kind of tension between, on the one hand, very direct sloganeering kind of modes of address that seem very DIY and ad hoc, as you label it, but at the same time also dealing with very complex issues and complex topics and subject matter and complex networks of thinking, researching, quite activist kind of practices with others, where sort of like thinking about the range of projects that you've outlined, particularly the websites as spaces of articulation. Yes, we could sort of like see them as archives of gathering information of what has unfolded over time. They're again also very active sites of articulation of those more complex kind of networks. And you mentioned My Villages, but you've also sort of like worked on other websites in relation to other projects. That then immediately asks the question, that directness of taping on the wall, you're there, you do that on your own. Websites, you work with others, books, you work with others. So the complexity of practices coming together there. How does that sort of inflect how you work on those more complex publishing projects?
Well, websites, usually we have a very good reason for having one, otherwise they're just too much work. So they're often to do with being able to publish and share a process. I think most websites have that. Like with the example of the Rural School of Economics, that really is giving us space, and I'm not sure how clear it is to the reader yet, but it's giving us space as My Villages to carefully describe who we work with, how we work with over time, the different contributors, collaborators that come together. I mean, those are always topics that are quite difficult to put on one page, you know, other than lists of names. So that a format of a narrative over time, it is quite suitable to a website. You know, a book will end at some point, where the narrative, we can think 10, 15, 20 years, and that's how long some of the relationships are. So websites are quite useful to like track those kind of long-term relationships and activities. The website, I still really, that's why I showed it with like a layout for Gasworks Gallery, was about taking away the kind of like myth of how does design happen, you know, like design happens because someone has an idea, there's a site, and you start changing something. So for that, in that context, the website was very much about making space to take everyday conversations quite seriously, categorize them as like places for ideas based on knowledge of people who use the place every day, and then track them through a design process. And again, this was about a process and rooting back the process, not to us as the authors and designers, but to us as in conversation or in collaboration with others who have ideas, and they get slowly translated.
It seems to also be a kind of openness and an awareness of hierarchies in terms of publishing. There's the one-off, the ad hoc, but there's also the carefully constructed either books or websites that can continue. And I'm sort of wondering, do you see any hierarchies, or are they for you all tools that you consider at particular moments in time for different kinds of purposes, because they function in different ways, they circulate in different ways, and they also allow you to engage in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm really very grateful to a few key people in my work over the last 20 years. One of the people is you, Gerrie, you know, who understand the thoroughness of making books. And Wapke from My Villages was very, very important to make me more aware of the reach and the longevity of a book. So I think for me, it is good to know both, you know, the kind of complexity of making the book, the kind of pain, the cost, the kind of slowness, and then at the same time still allowing myself to do very quick kind of pasting and sloganeering, but not to exclude any of those formats from any project. You know, I don't see a hierarchy in terms of, because if it's important work, it gets an important book. No, there are formats that have a different function in different contexts. So if you want to for us, if we wanted to bring this whole topic of the rural in a kind of more discursive, academic art context, then the format of an art book for an art audience was suitable. Often T-shirt printing is also suitable. But I think it really depends on the ambition of the moment. And many of the projects have all formats across, yeah. So there's sloganeering and the book and a whole range across within one project.
Yeah, there's a lot of remediation, translation from one form medium to the other. And particularly in relation to, indeed, Art on the Scale of Life, having worked with you and co-editors, Paul O'Neill and Mick Wilson, and designers and Endless Supply, who have worked with you on multiple publications and also websites, taken the time to sort of go through that process and think about how do we translate this massive heap and this wealth of material and values and process and networks into a publication that can circulate of its own accord within the sort of distribution and circulation channels that books have, and how does that then sit alongside, say, a website related to compost or other websites. So I think that sort of thinking across media and mediation and remediation has been an interesting process, certainly for me, but also one that indeed takes time. And thinking through, what if it is a final object, what do we leave out? What needs to be included? What is possible? What is impossible? Was a recurring question. Where also the notion of completeness, something that we sort of very aware of, wasn't possible given the breadth of networks that your your practice holds across various projects with different communities as they have unfolded over time. I'm sort of looking at the time, we're edging towards 1:40. I'm also aware that some questions have been put in the Q&A. But before we hand over to other questions, if there was one publication that you could do, having gone through various processes, anew, what might that do? Difficult question.
But an existing one.
Or something where you have ended up now, having done quite a lot of different kinds of publications, a lot of articulations of networks, research, values, having done Art on the Scale of Life, looking back at 2.5 decades, 3 decades of practice. What would you be interested in now?
Well, there's like 3 books on my list that I would like to do. And I think a lot of them have to do with reaching a wider audience, but also, let's say, making thinking that has quite solidified itself through practice to fix it and make it available. So like all the work around redrawing the economy, taking back the economy. And I mean, all of those projects often sit or are often developed alongside academics, publishers, big networks. So in that sense, it's more responsive. Now, within this bigger community of, let's say, community economies, take back the economy, many of us feel we actually need a book to make certain things quite explicit. So it's less led by what I think, but I think it's more led by recent work and where we see interest and want to make a subject accessible to relatively wide readership. So everything to do with like taking back the economy, the iceberg model community economies, clear communication around what it means. So that's a book on the list.
There's 2 others.
There's 2 others.
Very thank you.
Or are we opening up to wider questions?
Do you want to expand on that, Kathrin, or should we move to the questions?
Yeah, I think it would be nice to move to questions.
Okay, wonderful. We've had some fantastic questions coming up in the chat, some of which can connect back to what you've been talking about, and then also adding in some new threads as well. I'm going to try to get through as many of them as we can, and I might try to fuse some questions if they seem to be overlapping. The first one I'm going to come to, Matt McCallum has asked that they're interested in the way in which your thoughts, how you kind of reconcile the tension between the concept of the work as a kind of processual relationship building kind of dynamic process and the production of an artifact, a kind of the finality of a publication or the kind of production of something fixed through publishing, and how you kind of reconcile that relationship between those two parts of your practice, and whether that's a kind of necessary component of the practice for you, having those two aspects.
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe going back to Compost, where everything I have from my practice was in one space. And maybe also referring to Lumbung Documenta as an example of a space where we allow things to sit next to each other. You know, that just because this thing is a book or an object or not an object, none of them have to impose a hierarchy over the others. And that's how I see the publications on each level. So I think it's through usership where they get meaning and maybe scale, but not because I would impose an importance to one thing over the next. They exist for their very own reasons in their very different formats. But yeah, I think, I mean, Compost was just one exhibition, but I think Lumbung Documenta was a brilliant example of many outputs of many different forms of cultural work coexisting. Mm-hmm. And then they get pulled out for different discussions, for different reasons, like all the publications get pulled out today because we're talking about publishing. But that's how I see it, you know, through the usership things get meaning, but not through their format.
Mm-hmm. Another question from Ben Cranfield, who's wondered how you understand the relationship between the local and the distribution circulation of publishing, and how you kind of understand the meaning of publications operating beyond the local context of their production. So conversely, how do unlocalized forms like websites, etc., help produce a critical notion of the local?
Can I go back to examples? It makes it much easier for me. So my villages are part of a relatively large explicitly translocal network, mainly in Europe. We avoid the term international to not refer back to nationality as an identifier, but to pay attention and respect to local capacities and knowledge. So for those local networks, over the years, we've produced 3 books. And the last one was the Learn to Act book. And those publications are then mainly distributed through those networks. They're for those networks and distributed through those networks. And because they're relatively big, each partner gets 500 and distributes them into their network. So I think it's a way of organizing, you know, and that's why maybe this talk is quite loose, but any form of publishing is possible and any kind of distribution is possible, and you use it to support something you want to achieve. So for those very translocal networks, we mainly wanted the wider network to become more aware of each other and to have a book, you know, for a lot of communities who don't walk around with laptops, to have a book where you simply open and say, we are here and there are others. So there the book is really the main reason for the book was to make the wider network aware of each other and refer to each other and gain a sense of scale. And distribution was through networks. I'm not sure if this answers the question, but I think, I think distribution is a matter of organizing, you know, and you can distribute through many different ways. The Learn to Act book is distributed through Sternberg because there was a joint decision that this is a book of interest to a different audience with a different geography. Certain fanzines are only of interest maybe to just the local community, and then they stay within that scale.
Can I add one sentence? As in the bottom line on the cover of that book in particular also says multilingual. And I think that is also something to think about, as in so much publishing indeed happens in English. What if indeed we have an international community? What language do we speak? And how do we use text and images together to indeed communicate and disseminate information exchange? So that's a very pressing concern, but also something that indeed each publishing activity tends to take into account in some shape or form.
I'm going to try and group a few questions here. We've had a couple, and for both of you really, actually, Gerrie and Kathrin, a couple coming in really around how for students or for emerging practitioners and artists, how you kind of begin to develop, whether it's websites or publishing projects, and kind of decide upon the network that you work with, the publishers, the editors, you know, how that decision making and those contacts are kind of built and made. And then another question, I suppose, in relation to that, but kind of building on that, around what you both see as the kind of future for this type of work. So where this is kind of going, and what for the kind of medium of publishing and this form of practice, how you see that kind of developing.
Kathrin first.
Yeah, I mean, I would say publishing is a bit like an iceberg. You know, you see the books at the top and you don't see all the other formats beneath. I think as someone who wants to publish and is entering it, just pay attention to all the possibilities. You know, there is still a lot of independent book fairs. There's still a lot of networks around co-publishing. I think just pay attention to them and take them quite seriously, not just as stepping stones towards getting the big book, but as serious kind of co-working, co-producing networks that enable publishing. And we all know, as soon as we support those networks less, it's more likely they will disappear. So I think taking this actually quite seriously, the not high-end commercial, very glossy bookshelf, bookshop book. See what's around you. Who else is publishing? I mean, online, so much more is possible. You know, I come from a free social media generation where it's less natural to me to use that, but just be aware of collectivity in those networks and support.
Yeah, I sort of I agree with that. I think the spectrum of publishing platforms is only getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I think there's something really useful to sort of think about in terms of values. Where do you see the kind of values of publishing that chime with your own values? So it is indeed not about thinking about hierarchies, but what do you see being articulated and disseminated in what way that you see as a value for concerns, interests that you have at the moment, to engage wholeheartedly with those, whether that is indeed physical fanzines, small scale artists, self-led publishing, or other kinds of publishing. They all are all a value. They all contribute to a really sort of well-developed, sprawling kind of ecosystem in which they all have a place. And yes, money circulates in certain ways, and not everybody has access to that, but that doesn't mean that making things visible, articulating them through particular kind of forms and formats and platforms isn't possible. So it's looking for those opportunities that you feel do something that aligns with what you think is necessary, is useful, allows you to do something, to make something visible.
And I mean, I think, sorry, just to add on to this, I think there's access to means. You know, you can't publish if you don't have the means to publish. Just to be quite aware of that. And if you have access, do you just want to use this access to you? Can you organize it collectively? But I mean, there's Rhizo printing is great, just as one example, but take the means, access to the means of publishing quite serious, and organize them as much as you think about the publication. Mm-hmm. And the future of I think translation, there's like probably an issue of language. And again, I think remembering Lumbung last year, a kind of more playful way to introduce different language sets, different methods of communicating, not in a strict, we have to translate everything way, but more in a maybe we sitting next to each other way, like becoming more playful with this idea of multilingual again, and being very critical of if you don't speak English, you're not an artist.
That actually connects perfectly to a question that's come through from Kay and Lee around language within publications, and they said that it's fascinating to see the Rural School of Economics project presented in multiple languages. And I don't know if you wanted to kind of expand on that ideas around language further. I know it really resonates with our community here at the RCA.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I really mainly talk from practice here. It's a vast undertaking, like to translate, to literally translate, it's just a massive capacity issues, and maybe we just have to direct more money, more resources towards that. Maybe more resources into translating rather than printing. Not quite sure. I just know where we reach our capacity, and we say it, we don't always do it. So that's why I'm a little bit self-critical and hesitant to answer it as a person who knows. But also kind of be aware that, also recognize if there's an interest, let's say, of a non-English speaking community to be recognized within a more translocal network, the value of English is then bigger than remaining within. So it's discussed in relationship. Yeah, if someone wants to be recognized on a translocal level, then we might switch. But yeah, I think it's one of our biggest building sites.
Mm. Another question that's come in from Victoria Stepanets is wondering around if a publication can be seen, or how you feel about whether and how publications can be seen to operate as independent exhibitions, as spaces of exhibitions, forms of exhibition, without necessarily there being a physical exhibition in a gallery space kind of preceding the publication. And Victoria's asked if a publication is a kind of, you feel is a sufficient way to present a kind of curatorial idea or concept.
I mean, the great thing in art still is that we can do what we want to do and what we think is important, like, of course, I would say yes, a publication can be an exhibition, if you want to. And I mean, Gerrie, you probably know a million examples of artist groups who act on that scale of an exhibition.
Yeah, and I think then it's also worth thinking about whether we see publishing as potentially a curatorial environment rather than purely an exhibitionary environment, as another medium or environment to make exhibitions. I think the moment we open it up and say, well, we can use publishing as an environment in which we can articulate curatorial and artistic practices in interesting ways, I think there's so much scope. It isn't just about the conflation between the work, the exhibition, and the book as form. It is about thinking, well, how do we step into that space? What are the affordances of that space, whether that is a book, whether that is an online environment, as making something public, means of making something public. So I think there's an awful lot of scope. There are absolutely historical published precedents, but there's also in the contemporary, with websites, with other platforms, there's an awful lot to set our teeth in.
I'm aware we're coming out of time, so I'm going to try to combine two questions again, and hopefully we'll manage to get through as many as possible. Sabina Eastman and Bryony Large have both asked questions which kind of relate a bit more to your personal trajectory and your identity as an artist and the kind of evolution of your practice. Sabina's asked about how you your identity as an artist has evolved over the course of these projects and practices, and how you describe yourself as working in print media, conceptually, performance, etc. And does that sense of your kind of artistic identity, how does that relate to the work and kind of matter as part of what you're doing and as part of the kind of outcomes of your work? And then just on a kind of building on that slightly, but also going in a slightly different direction, Brian is interested in how you became, in how the kind of ideas behind My Villages evolved, and how the highlighting the rural as a place of cultural production, how that kind of became important to you, and what inspired you to kind of embark upon that type of work.
I start with the second one, which I think, no, I don't think, I know. All of us who founded My Villages were on this trajectory of like, wherever you're coming from, you're going to an art school, and art school is normally in a city, and then you stay there because that's where your art networks are, that's where the publishers are in the gallery. So you kind of like are kind of funneled into like an urban context for your work. And we just critically wanted to ask, why is that the case? And of course, it's the case because the rural is not seen as a place for interesting cultural production, but also there's no infrastructure, there's very little access. So that was the reason for starting My Villages, to actually make access for ourselves, but also make space for discussion around why is the rural not considered. And I think in that sense of like taking the freedom to push something you're passionate but also critical about, that's why I'm still an artist. And I'm many other things, but I think artist, like it's itself, it's still a kind of, you declare what you see as your practice and you insist that it is art. So you don't have to wait for others to confirm it or not. You do it in the first instance. Today when I saw just artist under my name, I was like, maybe I should do a few commas into other things. But I also like this clarity around it. I could also be described as a social entrepreneur. I hold a professorship, I'm publishing and so on. But there's interest in like what artists do in society. So I think the reason for me why I kind of keep this single word, because then it's easier to ask, so what's the function of art? What do you do as an artist? If I add others, it becomes clearer in the conversation.
Can I add one comment? Or sort of like extrapolating from that, as in having worked with you so closely, but also thinking about the title of the book, Art on the Scale of Life. I think we're so used to thinking about art as something that sits alongside but slightly separate from life. And I think what your practice really sort of like demonstrates is that when you take it as part of life very seriously, to use one of your phrases, if you take the potential of that very, very seriously, then there is no distinction, and you can work with that, and you can work in different ways that are not necessarily situated in this rarefied realm of museums and galleries, even though you do work within those. But I think that sort of lack of separation, that willful lack of separation, is quite important in how I think a lot of what you do functions.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, I think we're 1 minute away from 2, so I think we'll probably have to wrap it up there. But I just want to say to everyone who's posted their questions, and for those we didn't get to, a huge thank you for joining us and for asking your questions. And it's always fantastic to see so many rich responses coming through in the Q&A. So a huge thank you to everyone for being with us here for this conversation. And Kathrin and Gerrie, thank you so much. That was such a stimulating discussion. And Kathrin, seeing those slides at the beginning as well, and just seeing that kind of richness of the visual material and the relationship between text and image, and that kind of accretion of these different modes of practicing, the different formats you work across. And always good to see the alive prop of the bottle in the room as well, being held up, as well as the images on the screen. So we've got multiple formats and modes appearing, but huge thank you.
I have another one to show off. That's the smallest publishing printed tape.
Oh, brilliant. Well, and I saw that on the I was looking at the spine of
book, yeah.
So remediation going on in all directions. But I think just seeing, that freedom to work across these many different formats, many different contexts, and think about publishing from tape to bottles to blackboards and all these different aspects you've kind of introduced us to is so liberating and freeing for students and for practitioners as well, thinking about what publishing means beyond the book, but also in dialogue with the book as well. So a huge thank you to you both. Fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rosie. Thanks.
I would like also to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Kathrin, Gerrie, and Rosie, for sharing your insights and expertise. If you would like to connect directly with us, please follow the information on this slide, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody.